What I'm about to share with you is a real story that shook an entire community to its core. This actually happened. Sometimes the most terrifying dangers hide behind the faces we trust most. And when a child's voice finally breaks through the silence, everything changes. If this story moves you, please like and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now, let me tell you what really happened. In the peaceful riverside town of Millbrook, nestled among misty hills, lived 8-year-old Clarissa, a girl with eyes that once sparkled with joy. She shared a small ivy-covered home with her father, Richard, a man who had changed after loss touched their family. Years ago, Clarissa's mother, Margaret, had passed away unexpectedly. The house still held her memory: faded photographs, her favorite teacups, the soft shawl draped over the reading chair. Richard spoke of Margaret constantly, sometimes as if she were still there. To Clarissa, these stories felt both warm and strange. At night, Richard would wander the house restlessly. On some evenings, he would quietly enter Clarissa's room, lying beside her, seeking comfort in her presence. To her, it felt like a father's embrace at first. But as time passed, something beneath that comfort began to shift in ways that made her uneasy. During the day, life seemed almost normal. Richard made Clarissa breakfast, braided her hair clumsily, and walked her to school beneath towering elm trees. In the afternoons, they'd visit the market, buying fresh bread, sweet apples, and occasionally a new storybook. Yet behind Richard's tired smile, a heaviness lingered that Clarissa could feel but couldn't name. At home, the living room remained a shrine to Margaret. Her framed portraits, her piano, untouched yet polished weekly. Richard spoke to the photos sometimes, in whispers, sometimes in tears. And as Clarissa grew, her laughter echoing like her mother's, Richard's gaze would hold a strange intensity that made her uncomfortable. In the evenings, after tucking Clarissa in, he began staying longer by her bedside, sometimes reading from Margaret's old poetry books, sometimes just watching her. To Clarissa, it had once felt safe, but gradually, a feeling she couldn't explain began growing inside her, a feeling that whispered something wasn't right. Then came the first time he said it. "You remind me so much of her. Sometimes it's as if she never left," and a chill, faint but certain, touched Clarissa's heart. One autumn night, as rain tapped softly against the window, Clarissa had fallen asleep beneath her mother's old quilt. Richard entered quietly, watching his daughter for a long moment, as if caught between memory and present. Then he sat beside her bed, closer than felt comfortable. His presence that night felt different, heavier, more intense. Clarissa pretended to sleep, but inside her heart raced with confusion and fear. She didn't understand why, but every instinct told her this wasn't normal. This wasn't how fathers should behave. When he finally left, she lay awake for hours, a new kind of fear blooming in her chest. The days that followed seemed unchanged on the surface. Richard still made her lunches, still kissed her forehead before school, but a strange distance crept into his eyes, and simultaneously an uncomfortable closeness in his actions. He grew quieter, more unpredictable. At night, sleep became difficult for both of them. One sleepless dawn, Richard wandered the living room, tracing the spines of old photo albums. He opened one, pages filled with Margaret's laughter frozen in time. Then a smaller album fell loose, one of Clarissa as a baby. Her eyes, her smile, Margaret's echo. The lines between memory and present seemed to blur in his mind. That evening, as Clarissa played with her dolls, Richard watched from the doorway, his gaze lingering too long, too intently. When she looked up, something in his expression made her pause. He smiled quickly, but it felt forced. "You're so much like your mother," he whispered again. This time, the words felt heavier, more loaded with meaning she didn't understand. And in Clarissa's small heart, a quiet fear began to grow stronger. As weeks passed, Richard's behavior around Clarissa became increasingly concerning. Evenings, once filled with storybooks, now felt strained. His goodnight hugs became uncomfortably tight and long. He would make comments that confused her, comparing her to her mother in ways that felt wrong, making her feel like she wasn't seen as his daughter, but as something else entirely. Clarissa, too young to fully understand, sensed a wrongness blooming in the spaces between them. She began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, always anxious about what evening would bring. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled beyond the hills, Richard called her to the living room with an intensity that made her nervous. An old wooden chest sat open before him. Inside were faded love letters, Margaret's silk scarf, a pressed white rose. "Do you want to see what your mother loved?" he asked, his voice low and strange. Clarissa nodded hesitantly, not wanting to upset him. He draped the scarf around her shoulders, his hands lingering in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. A cold shiver ran through her. That night, as she lay in bed, her small hands clutched the quilt tighter than ever. For the first time, she wished desperately that her door had a lock. She wished she could tell someone, but who would believe her? What would she even say? She barely understood it herself. In the days that followed, a silence grew between them. Richard's behavior became more erratic, sometimes distant, sometimes too close. At night, Clarissa began pushing furniture against her door, though she couldn't have explained why if asked. Fear became her constant companion. She stopped sleeping well. She stopped eating properly. The light that once shone in her eyes began to fade. At school, her teachers noticed the dramatic change. Once bright and curious, Clarissa now sat quiet and withdrawn. Her drawings, once filled with flowers and sunshine, turned to empty skies and dark clouds. She flinched when people moved too quickly. She stopped raising her hand in class. Her favorite teacher, Mrs. Brennan, knelt beside her one afternoon during art class. Clarissa's hands were shaking as she colored, her lines jagged and chaotic. "Clarissa, sweetheart, is something bothering you at home?" Mrs. Brennan asked gently. Clarissa opened her mouth, but words wouldn't come. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? How could she put into words the feeling of wrongness, the uncomfortable looks, the touches that lingered too long? "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." "Always," Mrs. Brennan said, smiling gently and squeezing her small hand. "You don't have to carry heavy things alone." That night, Alina lay awake, those words echoing softly in her mind. "You don't have to carry heavy things alone." A tiny flicker of hope sparked amid the fear. A week later, on a cold morning wrapped in fog, Clarissa walked to school with small hands buried deep in her coat sleeves. Her steps felt heavier than ever, as if carrying the weight of a secret too big for her small frame. That day, during art class, Mrs. Brennan noticed Clarissa trembling more severely than before. Her small shoulders were hunched, her breathing rapid. At lunch, Mrs. Brennan gently invited her to the reading corner, a cozy space filled with pillows and soft light, away from other students. "Would you like to sit with me for a bit?" she asked with infinite gentleness. Clarissa nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. For a long moment they sat in silence. Then, barely audible, came a whisper. I don't feel safe at home anymore." Mrs. Brennan's heart clenched, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "Can you tell me why, sweetheart?" "You're safe here with me?" Clarissa's eyes brimmed with tears. "Daddy, he looks at me in ways that scare me. He says I'm like Mommy, but not in a normal way. He makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to be alone with him anymore, but I have nowhere else to go." The words trembled into the air, fragile but undeniable. This brave little girl was finally finding her voice. Mrs. Brennan wrapped her arms gently around her, being careful to be comforting but not overwhelming. "You did something incredibly brave by telling me, Clarissa." You're safe now. I promise we're going to help you." Mrs. Brennan acted immediately. After ensuring Clarissa was calm and safe with another trusted teacher she knew well, she contacted the school counselor and the appropriate authorities. By late afternoon, Child Protective Services and a kind officer arrived at the school to speak with Clarissa. Clarissa sat between Mrs. Brennan and the counselor, hands clasped tightly. With a trembling voice, she told her story, slowly, haltingly, but courageously. She spoke about the uncomfortable stares, the inappropriate comparisons to her mother, the feelings of being unsafe in her own home, the way her father's behavior had changed and made her feel like she wasn't his daughter, but something else in his confused mind. Each word weighed heavy on her small shoulders, yet simultaneously freed her from the silence she'd carried alone for so long. That evening, Richard was questioned and appropriate legal actions were taken. News spread through Millbrook quietly but firmly. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Parents held their children closer and had difficult but important conversations. And in the center of it all, Clarissa, so small, so fragile, felt both exposed and, for the first time in months, truly seen and believed. She was placed temporarily with a kind foster family known throughout the county for their gentle approach to helping children through difficult transitions. That first night in the new home, tucked beneath unfamiliar but soft blankets, one truth repeated in her heart like a healing mantra. I told. I'm not alone anymore. Clarissa's new foster family, Patricia and Lawrence, were gentle souls, both retired counselors with grown children of their own. They didn't pressure Clarissa to speak before she was ready. Instead, they created rhythms of safety. Warm breakfasts with her favorite foods, quiet story times, soft music in the evenings, and most importantly, predictable routines that helped her feel secure. Her new therapist, Dr. Olivia Sterling, met her with calm patience and professional warmth. At first, Clarissa sat curled in the chair, words locked behind weary eyes and walls built from fear. But Dr. Sterling taught her gently about how our minds work, how fear can make everything feel bigger and scarier, how carrying secrets can hurt us, and how speaking our truth can begin the healing process. "What happened wasn't your fault, Clarissa," Dr. Sterling said clearly and firmly during one of their early sessions. "Adults are responsible for their own behavior, always. You are brave, you are safe here, and you deserve to feel like a child again." Bit by bit, the knots of tension inside her began to loosen. One rainy afternoon, weeks into therapy, Clarissa whispered something profound. "I hated how everything felt. But I thought if I told anyone they wouldn't believe me, or they'd say I was confused, or they'd be angry at me for saying something bad about my dad." Dr. Sterling smiled softly, her eyes kind. "And yet you told anyway. That, Clarissa, is the bravest thing a person can do, speaking truth even when you're afraid. You saved yourself." A small seed of healing began to grow in Clarissa's heart. Healing wasn't a straight path forward. There were still nights when nightmares pulled her from sleep, gasping and afraid, mornings when she felt too anxious to eat breakfast, moments when loud noises or sudden movements made her flinch instinctively. But slowly, steadily, with each therapy session and each safe day in her new home, her voice, both literal and metaphorical, began to return. The scared whisper became stronger. The hunched shoulders began to straighten. One bright spring afternoon, Patricia found her at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, writing carefully in a small journal they'd given her for processing her thoughts and feelings. "What are you writing, sweetheart?" Patricia asked softly, not wanting to intrude, but curious. Clarissa looked up, and for the first time in many months, there was a hint of a real smile. "A story about a girl who was very brave." Patricia's eyes filled with proud tears as she kissed the top of Clarissa's head. "That sounds like someone very special that I know." In therapy, Clarissa learned important lessons about boundaries, about what healthy relationships look like, and about naming her experiences accurately. She learned that what happened wasn't confusing or uncomfortable. It was inappropriate boundary violations that no child should experience. "Sometimes I still feel angry," she confessed once, her voice shaking but stronger than before. "Not just at him, but at everything. At how long I stayed quiet, at how scared I was." Dr. Sterling nodded with understanding. "All of those feelings are completely valid and normal. Healing includes feeling all of those difficult emotions, not pushing them away. And anger? Anger can be powerful and protective. It tells us when something is wrong. You're allowed to feel it." With each word written in her journal, each truth spoken aloud in therapy, each day she felt safe, Clarissa slowly reclaimed her story, page by page, moment by moment. With time, triumphs began to outshine setbacks. The first time Clarissa returned to her regular school, her heart pounded with anxiety. Would everyone know what happened? Would they treat her differently? Would they whisper about her? But her classmates, who'd been told only that she'd been going through a difficult family situation, welcomed her with genuine warmth. Some had made cards, others simply smiled and included her in their games as if no time had passed. Mrs. Brennan met her at the classroom door with a steady smile that communicated both pride and support. "You are stronger than you know, Clarissa, and I'm so proud of you." At her foster home, evenings with Patricia and Lawrence became cherished rituals. Tea with honey, gentle conversations about school and dreams, shared books, and laughter that felt increasingly natural. One evening, Clarissa stood by the riverbank where her mother had once taken her when she was very small. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, peaceful and constant. Softly, speaking aloud to the night and to her mother's memory, she said, "I am still here, and I'm going to be okay." Those simple words held enormous power, a declaration of survival, of resilience, of hope. Later that year, encouraged by Dr. Sterling and her teachers, Clarissa entered a statewide writing contest with a poem titled "The Girl Who Found Her Voice." She wrote about fear and courage, about silence and speaking, about darkness and the journey toward light. To her surprise and quiet joy, her poem won first place in her age category. The certificate now hung above her desk in her foster home, a daily reminder of something crucial. She was more than what had happened to her. She was becoming who she chose to be, not who circumstances had tried to make her. When Clarissa turned 18, she made a quiet but significant decision. With Patricia and Lawrence by her side for support, she filed the legal papers to change her last name to Sterling, adopting Dr. Sterling's surname as a tribute to the woman who'd helped her heal, and symbolically claiming her own identity. "I am not defined by him," she said quietly at the courthouse. "I am not his. I belong to myself." That summer, she graduated high school with honors. At the ceremony, when her new name, Clarissa Sterling, was called, she stood tall, her voice clear, her heart steady. The scared little girl who'd once barely whispered was now a young woman who could speak her truth clearly. She pursued studies in psychology, driven by a clear purpose, to help other children who'd known fear too early, who'd learned to silence themselves, who needed someone to listen and believe. In university, she volunteered at survivor support groups and crisis hotlines. She never shared the specific details of her own story unless truly appropriate, but she listened with deep empathy, offered quiet strength, and helped others find resources and hope. One rainy afternoon after a group session, a younger girl whispered to her, "You help me feel less alone, like maybe I can get through this too." Clarissa smiled gently, her heart full. "That's exactly why I'm here. Because you can. I promise you can." The ripples of her courage were reaching further than she'd ever imagined possible. Years later, Clarissa settled in a quiet coastal town where the waves whispered constant reminders of resilience and change. The sea became her companion, its steady rhythm reminding her that life moves forward, tide after tide, and that we can choose to move with it. She worked with a nonprofit organization supporting young survivors of various forms of family trauma. Her calm presence and genuine understanding became a beacon of hope for many families navigating difficult situations. In time, she met Thomas, a kind social worker who understood the importance of patience, who listened without needing to fix everything, who loved her wholly and respected her boundaries completely. They married in a small ceremony by the sea, surrounded by the chosen family she'd built over the years. When their daughter Isabella was old enough to ask questions, she looked up at her mother one evening and said, "Mama, why do you help people who are hurting?" Clarissa knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her daughter's cheek with infinite tenderness. "Because once upon a time I was hurting too, and I thought the hurting would never end. But it can end. It does end. And I want others to know that truth too, that healing is possible, that speaking up matters, that they deserve safety and love." Standing by the window that evening, watching Isabella sleep peacefully, Clarissa whispered to the waves outside, "I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to become." And in that truth, a life fully her own continued to unfold beautifully. Now, years into her career, Clarissa often spoke to small groups of young survivors and their supportive family members, not as someone who had all the answers, not as a hero, but simply as someone who had once sat exactly where they were sitting. She never shared graphic details or anything that might be traumatizing. Instead, she offered what had once saved her: space to be heard, the quiet assurance that they weren't alone, practical resources for help, and the firm belief that healing was possible. At the nonprofit's community room, a simple journal sat on a shelf, its cover hand-lettered with the words, "For those finding their voice." It held poems, drawings, and letters from survivors to survivors, a chain of hope passed forward. Sometimes Clarissa would add a line of her own, always something encouraging and forward-looking. And when a new child came in, eyes wary, shoulders hunched, carrying silence like armor, she would greet them with the gentlest of smiles and these simple words, "You're safe here, and when you're ready, we're ready to listen." Because now she understood completely. Sometimes a single open door, a single listening ear, a single person who says, "I believe you," can change the entire course of a life. And sometimes the smallest voice, once given permission to speak, holds the power to echo through countless hearts and inspire countless others to find their own courage. A message of hope, friends. Difficult situations in families don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they're quiet, confusing, wrapped in complexity that makes speaking up feel impossible, especially for children. But here's what Clarissa's story teaches us. Our instincts matter. When something feels wrong, that feeling deserves attention and respect, not dismissal. For any young person watching this who feels unsafe or confused about someone's behavior toward them, you deserve to be heard. You deserve to be believed. Speaking up isn't betrayal, it's survival. And there are people ready to listen and help. For every adult, be the person who truly listens, not just to words, but to the pauses between them, to the changes in behavior, to the silence that sometimes screams louder than any cry for help. Ask questions with genuine care, create spaces where truth can be spoken safely, and when someone, especially a child, shows courage by sharing something difficult, believe them. Your response in that moment can change everything. Healing takes time, but it begins the moment truth is spoken and received with compassion. Remember, we are not defined by what happens to us. We are defined by how we choose to move forward, how we help others, how we turn our pain into purpose. If this story touched your heart, please remember that somewhere, someone might need to hear it today. Like, share, and comment below. Your engagement might give another person the courage they desperately need. Have you ever faced a moment when your instincts told you something wasn't right? What helped you find the courage to speak or act? Share your thoughts in the comments. They might light the way for someone else here. And if this story moved you, our next one will inspire you even more. Subscribe and stay with us. More stories of resilience, courage, and hope are waiting to be heard. Remember, your voice matters, your story matters, and you are never, ever alone.